This is probably the most important effect because it's used in like almost every R&B track. Finally, this is probably the craziest tip in this tutorial. And as for the bass, this is super important to understand. And this is where having these VSTs counts the most. Alright, what's good YouTube? So in this tutorial, I'm going to be going over how to make proper R&B beats for artists such as her, SZA, Bryson Tiller, Kalani, Giveon, and many others. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make proper chord progressions, how to make your piano beats sound real, the best plugins and presets to use, the best drum sounds and kits as well, the best VSTs, as well as various tips and tricks along the way. Also, if you want any of the sounds or samples that I use in this tutorial, there's a link in the description where you can download them completely free. Also, something I want to briefly mention, after the first beat review that I did, I noticed that I got like sent way too many beats before I actually went live, and because of that I couldn't go over all the beats that people were actually sending to me in the moment. So I think going forward what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna only go through the beats that are being sent during the live stream. So people should probably stop sending me beats because I'm getting like 100 emails a day. So yeah, just going forward I think everyone should know that. Yeah, but with that being said, let's talk about R&B. Okay, so let's talk about melodies. So for R&B tracks, you usually want to sit in the tempo ranges of like 130 to 90. It all depends on the type of vibe though that you're going for, because there's multiple types of R&B tracks. Generally for the more bass heavy and sad R&B tracks, you're going to be in the lower ranges of those tempos, and for the more uplifting and like drum heavy R&B tracks, you're going to be in the higher BPMs. So when I think of R&B sounds, stuff that comes to mind right off the bat is like real pianos, guitars with and without effects, low filtered sub bass sounds, analog bells, Vox samples and one-shots, weird arpeggiators, harp sounds, and choirs. So I'm gonna go over the best VSTs for each of these. The best VSTs for like weird analog sounds is Analog Lab, and it's honestly unmatched. For pads, keys, and like weird dry sounds, Omnisphere is always gonna be the best. For pianos, there's a lot of good contact libraries you can see. Personally though, my favorite is Pianotech 6. It's this little piano VST, and what's so good about it is the fact that it has so many different presets for live piano, so you can really get like the perfect sound that you're going for depending on the type of beat. For guitars, there really isn't like a best VST. I do think though, if you want to get a real sound, you should invest in contact guitars. Like real guitar is pretty good, and Omnisphere is also pretty good, but like if you really want to get like a real sound, the only way you're going to do that is through contact, because you can still tell the difference between a real guitar and something that's being played out of a VST. But regardless of that, there still isn't like a full set of libraries that are ever going to give you the sound that you're looking for, especially when it comes to R&B. And in the case of R&B, it's really all about knowing how to like use effects to make it sound real, which I'm going to be talking about throughout this entire tutorial. So in making it, I find that it's best to start with like non-layered, less dry, and more analog sounds such as simple pianos, pads, or guitars. So looking at this example, for R&B tracks, almost always the entire melody is just going to be a chord progression with a few notes playing around it. You also want to make sure that you use a lot of notes, because harmony is really important because you got people singing on your beats after all. Finally, this is probably the craziest tip in this tutorial. After all the R&B tracks I deconstructed, I noticed that the vast majority of the R&B chord progressions aren't even in like a particular scale whatsoever, which is crazy to think about. So why I'm saying that is for those who are using like MIDI scales as templates when they make their melodies. I know I used to do that back in the day. That's not going to work for this because, you know, it's not going to be in any sort of specific scale. With that being said, as for tips that you can use when making your melodies, try starting with like the pre-given chord selector in the piano roll. To get it, all you have to do is right click the pencil in the top left and a whole list of chord progressions will come up. Then take any minor 7th or 9th, or really just any minor chord with a lot of notes, and just keep cloning it over and over, and just change a few notes to the second version, maybe pitch it up or down, whatnot. You can move certain notes, do what you want. The reason I'm saying this though is one thing that I did notice with these types of progressions is that there's a lot of notes between the chords that are the same, with the exceptions of only like a few that get pitched up and down, or at least some of the notes being moved, you know, changed. One note gets added, one gets removed. So just experiment with this however you like, because it's probably the closest thing you're gonna get to like finding a formula for making these types of tracks. It might be easier to do it this way for you, it might not be. You could just go by ear and do one note at a time. It's personally up to you and based off how much experience you have making melodies. But overall, there really isn't much music theory behind it, and for a first time, like I don't really have a way of explaining it in words. Instead, I can just show you like melodies like this one. So when starting from scratch, you want to go for simple but not too simple. Just doing a single chord progression can get boring, so what you want to do to fix this is add a few notes all around the progression to make it way less repetitive, and or layer it with various sounds and effects to make it more interesting. Another way you can make the melody more interesting is by creating reverse chords. So these are the two easiest ways to do this. First, what you can do is hit Alt-Y on your keyboard, select reverse horizontally, send that melody to the mixer, add Edison, and record the melody. Now when you reverse that new sample we just created, it will play the exact same progression you originally laid out but in reverse. Another way of reversing your chords is by turning the attack knob up a lot in your envelope for whatever VST you're using. This will make the sound fade in as if it's being played in reverse without changing the original sound itself. Another cool trick you can do is using the strum feature by hitting Alt-S on your keyboard. This will make your progression progression sound like it's being strummed by a real person, kind of like a harp, to give it this cool effect. Finally, but most important, one thing you should almost always be doing is randomizing the velocities, how I talked about in the last 2 tutorials, by hitting Alt-R on your keyboard, then messing with the velocity knob in the randomizer. So when you've done all that to your liking, you then want to go about layering your sounds. Specifically, I'd say go for like airy stuff that's not too busy or sharp to your ear. This is where you should probably use like something like, I'd say, Expand or Omnisphere. Yeah, but it's all about going to your liking. The only thing I'd say is that if you're gonna add a lead melody of some sort, keep it simple, don't make it too busy, because even when you have a lead sound, it's usually but not always going to be sitting below or at the same levels of the chord progression. So you don't want to choose a sound that stands out too much or has like too many layers and effects. And you can honestly get these in any VST, but I find Omnisphere specifically also has the best library for these, but it's not necessary. Also, a cool trick you can do with the leads is try intentionally making the lead off time to further help make it sound like it was being played by hand. And as for the bass, this is super important to understand. You almost always want to be using a sub bass and generally avoiding 808s. Also, you should stick to bass presets that revolve around like sine waves, because we don't want our bass to stand out too much and be like too sharp to the ear. Again, the best VSTs for this are Omnisphere and Analog Lab, and this is where having these VSTs counts the most, because you don't want to go for like a cheap bass sound that you could find in like your average VST, because the bass is kind of like the heart of the R&B beat. Everything else can be perfect, you know, you can have a perfect melody, perfect drums, cadence, and all that, but the beat will be single-handedly ruined if you choose a really bad bass preset. So here's an example of a bad bass preset. So here's an example of a good bass preset. Some of my favorite presets to use are the Prid Sidechain Bass in Nexus 2, the Moog Taurus Super Sub, Terrafirms, Modular Big Booty, and Deep Taurus FM2 bass sounds in Omnisphere. The Dark Bass preset in Analog Lab 4 is pretty good, and the Scarby Bass preset in Contact. Finally, R&B tracks tend to contain these like background Vox sounds that just add to the vibe and cadence of the beat. What you want to do is just take any sample you want and slice the part that you like in Edison, mess with the envelope in the sampler to get what you exactly want, then just flood it with reverb and delays to give it a more ambient feel. This is something that you hear a lot more in the alternative R&B stuff, as I'll show you later. So let's talk about the drums. This is by far the easiest part of making these beats, because the drums are incredibly simple and they really just revolve around 3 things. The first is the kick. You ideally want to go for like thick bass heavy kicks rather than like the short but sharp trap kicks. The second is the snare. Usually you don't want to use claps. You still can, but it's all up to you. Just note that if you are using a clap, you should generally aim to use like more loose sounding ones rather than like the traditional like tight clap sounds that you hear in trap beats. Also, if you are using a snare, usually stick to ones that are really tight, and then you can just like add reverb later if you want to make it sound a little more loose. Sometimes they should sound more like the presets that you find in like old drum machines, kind of like the Roland TR-808 stuff, but it's really all up to you depending on what sound you're going for. Finally, do note that the levels for R&B aren't the same as trap, meaning that if you watched my mixing tutorial, like I said in there, the kick is almost always going to be louder than the snare and clap, but that's not true, because R&B beats are more level like pop music in the sense that like the snare is usually at the same level, if not in most cases higher or louder than the kick, so keep that in mind. The next are the hi-hats. Unlike with trap beats, you usually don't want to use like a lot of 2-step patterns. Instead, you want to normally use like 4-step patterns, and if not, a lot of the times you'll also just hear a bunch of spaced out hi-hats with long stretched out hi-hat rolls placed at certain points. The key thing though to understand is that since we're using slower tempoed beats, you don't want to use like insanely tight and quick hi-hat rolls. Also, I messed with the velocity a little bit, and I think you should too. For one, you can create this cool fade effect, as you can see that I'm doing here, or what you can just do is mess around with it how you like, because that'll make it sound more real, and again, that's what we're going for these types of beats. So that's what this sounds like. For these types of drum sounds, I find that the best drum kits are the BWB, Creep, and Wonder Girl kits. Like I talked about in the Wonder Girl tutorial, they have a lot of like bass heavy kicks and snares, as well as a lot of experimental stuff such as Vox sounds and various perks. And for those who bought my drum kit, there's also a lot of those types of sounds in there. Link in the description if you want it. Yeah, but that's honestly it. There's nothing else to it. It's really all about simplicity with these drum patterns. This is what the whole drum pattern sounds like with this beat. Yeah, but with that being said, let's talk about the most important part of this tutorial, and that's the effects. When making these types of beats, it's so important to understand both when and like how to use effects properly. So there are four main effects that I feel like every R&B producer needs to know because they're going to use it at some point in their beat. The first one is the low pass filter. This is probably the most important effect because it's used in like almost every R&B track. It's just a type of EQ that cuts off the high end of the beat and gives it like that signature underwater feel. I'd advise, depending on what style you're going for, to put this on almost every sound you use, with the potential exceptions of like snares, kicks, and presets that already have a low pass filter on them. Another thing you can use is the Fruity Love filter, specifically the low pass preset. And what you want to do is just mess with the cut knob until you find a point that you like. Personally, I like to put it on the master just so I can filter everything equally, as well as browse presets and make my melodies with the love filter constantly on. Again, it's all up to you. The only thing I find myself EQing constantly is the high end, like off my bass sounds, so I'd always recommend doing that. Yeah, but that's it for EQs. The second and almost as important effect is reverb. Personally, the reverb I like to use for these types of beats is Valhalla Vintage Verb, but you can really use any reverb that you want. It doesn't matter too much. The main thing though that you want to understand is the decay, size, and EQ of your reverb. Decay determines how quickly like the reverb fades out, so when using it, understand that the bigger the gaps between the notes you're applying it to, the longer the duration generally should be. You know, you want to make sure that the reverb isn't constantly overlapping itself, so that's why one shot like box sounds tend to have much longer reverbs, and stuff like hi-hats have like shorter and like barely noticeable reverbs. Also note that the size will determine how big the reverb is, and the EQ, you know, is self-explanatory. The things you'll tend to see with reverb in R&B tracks are like the hi-hats, snares, box sounds, and keys, mainly the pianos. But that's it for reverb. The next thing you want is some sort of tape emulator. Personally, I like RC20 the most. As some of you can probably tell, a constant theme in this tutorial is trying to make our instruments sound analog. RC20 helps doing that by making it sound like the beat is being processed through like old tapes and vinyl records by adding all these various effects. I'd say go through the presets how you like. I usually just use the default one, mess with the EQ, and turn down the crackling sound a little bit. It also just helps give the melody a little more character, which you can also accomplish by like taking real sounds like car engines, traffic, trains, rain, bird noises, really anything that just sounds real, because that's the type of vibe we're going for. But just make sure to filter and not have too many things stand out in the beat, as you want it to be barely noticeable and not like stand above everything. But that's it for tape emulators. Finally, the last thing you want to know is delay. You specifically hear delays more often like the alternative styled R&B songs. Its main purpose is just to help amplify sounds like Vox one-shots and various background noises just to sound more ambient. I've also heard a lot of people put delay on their hi-hats before, so you can go try that out. But here's an example of this in a beat I made. There's a background ear candy sound that just sits in the background. Without delay or effects, it sounds like this. But with the delay and effects, it now sounds like this. But yeah, apart from that, that's all you really need to know for effects. Alright, but that's going to be it for this tutorial. Let me know what you guys thought and what you'd like me to do in the next one. Also, let me know if you guys want me to release all my tutorial beats in a video, because I see a lot of people asking for that. Also, if you guys want me to do like a Q&A for 25k subscribers, now let me know in the description. Make sure to buy my drum kit. That's also linked in the description. Make sure to follow me on Instagram and Twitter at FinnaFinesse. I'm probably going to do my last giveaway in the next video, so make sure to go check that if you still want to win it. Apart from that, make sure to like, subscribe, and peace.